Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see you all here this afternoon for our session, Ask the Experts, Ovarian Cancer and Clinical Trials. My name's Rachel Munyai and I'm Head of Services here at Target Ovarian Cancer, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr Rebecca Bowen, Consultant Medical Oncologist, who will be delivering this session and answering your questions. We are also joined by Thomas Tylee, who is a Lead Clinical Trials Officer, who will also join the Q&A panel towards the end of the session. So first of all, I'd like to run through briefly what to expect for the session this afternoon. I hope you're all really looking forward to the session, as I certainly am. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Rebecca Bowen about clinical trials, what to expect, how to access them, and what the different phases of clinical trials means. And following that, it's your chance to have your questions answered by Rebecca and Tom in our live Q&A session. So in terms of disclaimers, please bear in mind that anything that comes out of this session isn't medical advice and isn't a substitute for the information and advice that you've been given by your own clinical team. We are not able to offer answers to very specific individual situations today, but the idea of this session is that you can get that overview about any conversations you'd like to have with your own team. So let's get the event started, and we will begin with a recording from Sylvia. Sylvia has a diagnosis of ovarian cancer and she will be sharing her experience of taking part in a clinical trial.
Hi, my name's Sylvia. I'm going to talk about cancer trials that I've been on over the past couple of years. A little bit about me. I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer back in 2021, stage 3C, and I followed the usual path. Diagnosed in April 21, I had the debulking operation in June 21. July started chemotherapy quite quickly because my CA125 was very high. And so I started the cycle of chemotherapy, and after chemotherapy I was fortunate to be no evidence of disease. Started Avastin, but had my first recurrence in 2022. So back onto chemotherapy. So that's my initial diagnosis. So just a little bit about me. I'm 61. I live in Southeast London. I'm a manager for the NHS ICB. I live at home with my two children. My eldest daughter is 23. My youngest is 20. Who give me quite a lot of support. And I receive my treatment at Guy's and St Thomas's hospital, where I'm still being treated. So it was presented to me in 2023 the opportunity to look at trials. I think I just finished chemotherapy and it was looking at different options that the paths that I could follow, because I think the opinion it was that my cancer, although it's not on my internal organs or anything, it wasn't actually going. And it was a break from chemotherapy. What were my other options? So I agreed to look at trials. And one of the trials that we looked at was MORAB 202. Part of the process for that was that to go, so my oncology team, they went through all the trials, and they found trials that were appropriate for my type of ovarian cancer. And the MORAB trial seemed to be the most appropriate. So as part of the process is that you are given a pack of information, so very detailed information. So you know who's the lead doctor, it's usually your oncologist, there's usually a trial team, usually two nurses, CNS nurse, like CNS nurses, and two research people. They're usually very friendly, look after everything. And so your oncologist will took me through all the information in the pack. I was very nervous, to be quite honest. I'd heard about trials but never been involved in trials. So you have the opportunity to ask any questions that you want. Also, they do rigorous tests to see if you meet the criteria, things like ECGs, test your eyes, test your kidneys, test absolutely everything to make sure that you are fit to be able to do the trial. So that process was fine. It didn't take long, and all the time before I signed the pact to say I agreed to do the trial, I had the opportunity to ask as many questions as I want, if I didn't understand any of the information. And there was as I said, there's a trial team that takes care of you, answers all your questions. You're given a timetable of how the trial will work once you've signed up to it. The MORAB was weekly. At first it was a bit intense because I work full time, but I soon got into the rhythm. It was by infusion, attending the hospital once a week. And I was very fortunate in that I didn't really have any side effects that were hospitalised me or that were very noticeable. The usual, I did feel tired, but from recollection there wasn't. I was just very lucky. I did also link, you don't normally link with other people on the trial just for governance and other reasons that they give you, but I did link with someone in Scotland who was also on the trial, and that they didn't really have many side effects either. So I managed to stay on that trial for about 11 months, which was really good. It was good for the trial, and it was good for me personally because I was having a break from having chemotherapy. It wasn't intrusive, just by infusion. As I said, that I didn't feel that didn't feel unwell on the trial, so it was very good. I did find that the whole process, I was very well informed. I could ask any questions. I could say no at any time. It says that in the pack as well. You don't have to, even if I've signed, I can still withdraw from the trial. My personal care plan, it meant that I had a break from chemotherapy. And as my oncologist said, we're in 2025 now, so I've done 2 trials in all. And I've just gone back to chemotherapy. I haven't been on chemotherapy since 2023. So it was an opportunity to have a break from chemotherapy. So yes, from my personal experience, it was very beneficial, and I hope this has been helpful, just to give you an insight into being on a cancer trial. And I would recommend looking at cancer trials, at least looking at them and see is this something for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sylvia. We know it will have been so helpful for others to have heard your story and your experience of being on a clinical trial. So next up in the session, we have Dr. Rebecca Bowen, who will be delivering a presentation.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Thanks very much for inviting me, and for inviting Tom Tylee, who has run our clinical trials team in Bath with me over the last, I want to say 10, but it's probably getting close to about 14 years now. So I'm just going to run through basically what clinical trials are, because it can often be a bit of a grey area. People often assume that we're doing trials and people are guinea pigs. In want of another term, that's often something that we hear. And I want to reassure you that that isn't the case. There are some studies that are very, very early studies, and we'll come to those, where very little is known about the drug. But an awful lot of the trials, and the ones that you may well come across in gynae cancers, the drugs are relatively well understood. It's just looking about where best we use them and how best we use them, and who best receives them. So what are clinical trials? Essentially a type of research study that's looking at the safety and, of course, the effectiveness of a new medical intervention, be that a drug, a therapy, it might even be a device, on human volunteers. And we design them specifically to determine whether a new treatment works. So they need to be robust statistically to make sure we're answering the question properly. We need to be able to say then confidently whether it works better than an existing treatment, or whether or not it's got any harmful side effects. And so a lot of thought and effort is put into designing clinical trials, often with the help of statisticians, in order to make sure that we have the right number of patients or volunteers who are in the trial, in order to be able to appropriately answer that question. Next slide, please. So the first type of clinical trial that you may come across is an observational clinical trial. Essentially, in that, as researchers, we're observing participants and we're collecting data about these participants and the treatments that they're receiving without actually intervening or assigning treatment. So they're having a treatment anyway, and we're collecting data about this. Now, one example of this in ovarian cancer is the Monitor UK study, which has completed recently. This was a study that was looking at data in a real-world setting. Often clinical trials are quite particular in terms of the features that people need to have relating to fitness and other medical conditions. But often in the real world, we're treating, importantly, far more people. And is this still safe? Is it as effective? Monitor UK was looking at collecting data on people who were receiving niraparib, which is one of the PARP inhibitors, which is used as maintenance treatment following response to platinum-based chemotherapy in advanced ovarian cancer. And so it was opened in a number of centres across the UK, collecting data about, for example, patients' blood pressure, their blood tests, were there dose reductions that were needed? Did people complete their treatment? Did they need to stop because of side effects? And looking at it in a much larger and broader population than might have been able to get into the original clinical trial. This is now recently completed, and the data regarding this is starting to be published. A really important trial, which meant that the people we were treating didn't have any adjustments to their treatment at all based on being part of this trial. They needed to fill in a quality of life questionnaire to see how they were both before starting the treatment and on treatment. But ultimately, it didn't impact at all on the treatment that they received. And these are the sorts of studies that I think are some of the easiest to get involved in to provide information, but understanding that this doesn't affect treatment and doesn't necessarily provide an extra treatment for somebody. Next slide, please. And then we have the interventional clinical trials. This is where the trial is actually meaning that we do something specific. There's a specific intervention that will affect the participant. Now, that might be a different treatment. It might be the addition of a treatment to an existing treatment or a procedure. And that will evaluate or assess and test the effects of what we've done in this trial, test the effects of the intervention on their health and on their outcome. There are different phases of interventional trials according to the stage of development, knowledge about the drug and the assessment of the particular therapies. And we will look at that now. Next slide, please. So the earliest one would be a phase one. We call it an early phase trial. This is essentially the first step for testing new treatments like new drugs in people. These usually involve a small number of patients. They often open in the context of cancer trials to people with any type of advanced cancer. So the phase one trials are often, but not always, often not, for example, specifically for ovarian cancer, but patients with ovarian cancer may be included within the trial to see what the effects of this new drug might be. Because the dose of the drug that's safest and most effective isn't yet known, the safety profile of that drug isn't yet fully known, they're usually considered for people who've had pretty much all of the other treatment options that are available for their disease. And there are some caveats to that. But phase one tends to be something that people might be considered for or offered for when they've been through a number of lines of standard treatment already. Next slide, please. The idea of these studies basically to find out how much of this new drug is it safe to give an individual. We want to give the most effective level of drug with causing the minimum amount of side effects. It's a balance always. What are the side effects of this treatment? How do they affect an individual? Are there any overlapping side effects based on previous treatments or due to the underlying cancer? We look to find out what happens to the drug in the body. This will often involve blood tests. It may involve scans, looking to see how the body processes the drug. How quickly does the body get rid of the drug? And of course, importantly, are there any signs that this treatment is improving the cancer? These early phase trials, phase one trials, are usually only available in certain cancer centres. They are more difficult to run. They require a sort of a bigger service. You will often see these in some of the biggest cancer centres. Doesn't mean that you can't be treated in one or be part of one. If you're not being treated in a bigger cancer centre, you can be referred to them. They're often somewhat altruistic because it's often about giving information about the drug without necessarily an expectation of getting benefit from the drug, although people do. And it can be quite a commitment in terms of visits, blood tests, scans that are in addition to what might normally be needed to receive a treatment. Next slide, please. If a phase 1 trial is successful and it shows that a particular treatment that we're looking at is safe and might be showing some early signs of benefit in a particular area, then a larger phase 2 study is designed and set up, which can determine better which particular cancers the treatment will work for, what the best dose of treatment it is, or the best dose of drug it is to give, and what the side effects are, and importantly, how to manage them. So a new treatment in this setting might be compared with another treatment already in use, or it might be compared with placebo, a dummy drug, an inactive drug. Some phase 2 trials are randomised, and you'll see that randomisation means that essentially the clinician, the doctor, the trials officer, the patient have no role in the decision about whether they receive the study drug or the dummy drug, or they receive the new drug or the standard drug. It's allocated by computer, and that's done deliberately to make sure that the individuals receiving the study drug look similar in terms of things like age, disease type, previous treatments received, to name but just a few. So that the two sides of the trial are what we call properly balanced. We can make a proper comparison. What we don't want to find is that there's a large number of more unwell people who've got lots of different other drugs, that have got lots of other medical problems just on one side, compared with the other side where people are particularly fit and perhaps more able to deliver the treatment, because we may not be able to answer the question about whether the drug is any better or safer. So they're set up with good care to be able to answer these questions, and the randomisation is important. It essentially means that a computer is randomly allocating which treatment group a particular individual receives. So at the end of a phase 2 study, if the new treatment seems to work well, then it will usually need to be tested in a larger study so that more patients are included in the study, and we can get a much better idea and more robust answer as to whether or not this treatment is at least as good, if not better, than standard treatment. Next slide, please. So an example of a phase 2 study looking at the ovarian cancer portfolio is a study called RAMP 201. Now, this was a study that was designed for a less common type of ovarian cancer, a low-grade serous ovarian cancer. So about 10% of serous ovarian cancers are low-grade, most are high-grade. And these respond slightly differently to chemotherapy, but have got certain alterations within them, certain changes that mean that they can respond to more targeted treatments. And this is, these names are very difficult to pronounce even when you've practiced, avotometinib, which is a MEK inhibitor with or without a FAK inhibitor called defactinib. So these are two oral medications that were thought in combination, having done lots of tests in the laboratory, to be potentially beneficial. And we already knew that a drug like the MEK inhibitor, trametinib, was beneficial in low-grade serous ovarian cancer. And we'd seen in this combination in phase 1 that there was quite a high rate of response to these treatment that was durable, i.e. that the response was maintained for a good period of time. So this study was designed to try and work out what the best dose of this combination of the two drugs was, because sometimes when you put the two together, you need to have different doses than if you were going to give them individually on their own. and also to have a look and determine the efficacy of this optimal regimen. So this is what RAMP 201 did. It was a successful trial, and subsequently now has led to RAMP 301, which is open in certain centres across the country and is comparing this combination with the best dose, so the safest and most effective combination of these two tablets, compared with standard of care treatment as decided by the oncologist that's treating. So that's a study that's ongoing in the UK, a successful phase 2 that's led to a phase 3. Next slide, please. And so then moving on to the phase 3 study. So this is, as I say, is comparing new treatments with the best currently available treatment or standard treatment. And we need to find out which treatment works better for a particular type of cancer. We want to learn more about the side effects in a larger number of people to make sure that some of the rarest side effects are picked up. And importantly, to see how treatment affects people's quality of life. So these usually involve many patients, hundreds, sometimes thousands of patients, depending on the disease type and the question being answered. And this is because differences in success rates may be quite small, so we need many patients to be able to confirm this statistically. Most phase 3 studies are randomized, so again, a computer would decide which treatment an individual will be receiving. And these studies are often open in many cancer centres. They can be often across the country. Next slide, please. So an example of a phase 3 study in ovarian cancer would be ICON 8. Now, this was a study open in many centres across the country, looking at the first-line treatment for advanced ovarian cancer. And this was done before we were using PARP inhibitors as standard of care. So this was a little while ago now. And this looked at the standard treatment of 3 weekly carboplatin and paclitaxel, and comparing different schedules of the same drugs. So in some ways, quite a straightforward trial. No new drugs, but just different ways of giving them. And so a third of patients received the 3 weekly standard. A third of patients had their carboplatin every 3 weeks, but their paclitaxel every week. And the bevacizumab, I shouldn't have put in there, apologies. And the third option is weekly carboplatin with weekly paclitaxel. Large numbers of patients were included in this, and we were able to include at the end of follow-up that the weekly schedule was not significantly better than the standard of 3 weekly. It's useful for some patients and is certainly used, but overall, we did not need to switch in the UK to have everybody having 18 weeks of weekly treatment. We could continue with the 3 weekly schedule, and that is the same across the world. Next slide, please. So how do you access clinical trials? You may be offered a clinical trial by your treating team, the oncologist, your surgeon, the nurse specialist, and certainly when studies are being actively recruited in centres, the enthusiastic team may well suggest it for you. And in most places, we would be looking to try and open clinical trials wherever possible, but mindful of the fact that not every centre can open all clinical trials. So it's important to ask, and if it's something you're particularly interested in, then do ask, is there a trial that might be suitable for me? It tends to be that these trials are available to people at a point where the disease is changing. That's not always the case, but in most cases, if the disease was changing, the disease was progressing, and you're looking at new treatment, a new line of treatment, then asking a question, is there a clinical trial in this area? It may not be that there's one in your local cancer centre, but there may be one that you can be referred to. In that instance, you're going to want to find out where, how far to travel, what are the additional things that I'd be required to do to be part of the trial. And do ask the target ovarian cancer team. You have access to them. They may well be able to tell you where certain trials are open. And then your treating oncologist could refer you to the trial centre. Next slide, please. The issue with clinical trials is the eligibility. They're usually strict, as I said before, in terms of physical fitness, other medical problems and other medications. And that's really to give the drug the best chance of showing promise. And then we can look at it in the real world setting in all patients. They're often strict in terms of blood tests, so things like kidney function, liver function, heart function, depending on the drug. They will stipulate with absolutely no flexibility whatsoever at all, despite our best efforts sometimes when it seems really frustrating that something's really, really very close and near. But they're very, very clear on cut-offs for this. There often needs to be something called measurable disease. That will mean that the radiologist might be able to see a lump, a deposit, some area of cancer that is measurable, so that they can see whether there's been a reduction or possibly an increase in the tumour size to assess the benefit of the treatment. Sometimes it can be that they're looking at it as a blood test, and the CA125 tumour marker can sometimes be used as a measure of response. But for the most part, it tends to be that there's disease that's visible that will allow evidence and so that we can then assess the benefit of a treatment. And sometimes there's a requirement for tissue samples. I already said about blood tests and the need for repeat blood tests. Often it will be just the biopsy sample of the original ovarian cancer, and or if there's been surgery, a representative sample from the surgery. Sometimes trials will require a repeat biopsy, and that's a biopsy that's not needed in terms of the actual treatment, but is there for the benefit of the question. And it might be that we're looking to see, are there certain changes within a tumour that have occurred that mean that this drug is more or less likely to work, for example. But sometimes it is mandatory to have a tumour biopsy in order to go into a clinical trial, assuming it's safe to have one. Next slide, please. So what to expect? We've already heard a fantastic study there from just a few moments ago about what it feels like to be in a clinical trial, and everybody's very different, but I think in general there tends to be a little bit more involvement. You might find that you get to know a larger number of staff through the trials team. If it's an early phase trial, you tend to have lots of blood tests, regular observations recorded, things like blood pressure, pulse, ECGs. Often more in the way of scans. You might spend more time in hospital, either as an outpatient or with a phase 1 trial. You might well be admitted and have some hospital stay that you might not have otherwise done. Quite often you'll need to complete quality of life questionnaires. And that's really quite important for the study. Some of these will be online, some of these will be paper questionnaires. Often there's an option depending on your preference on that. And you may be required to document your side effects and the medications that you've taken, either for the trial or other medications, and bring them back when you come to your next appointment for your team, so that we can record that data for the trial. Next slide, please. So in terms of trials on the horizon, there is a lot of interest in these antibody drug conjugates. And we heard just a little bit earlier about the MORAB study, which is looking at just one of these. It's a different antibody used in the MORAB study, an alpha folate receptor antibody. This is looking at a antibody called CDH6, which is present in over 60% of ovarian cancers. It's being trialled in early studies, a phase 2 study. This is basically where a antibody is used to push up to the cancer cell, and then when it's attached to the cancer cell, deliver the chemotherapy drug into the cancer cell, so that the majority of the damage, if you like, is to the cancer cell itself and limiting the damage to surrounding normal cells. This type of approach, I often think of it being a little bit like a dumper truck, which is parking up into a specific parking space, and only when it's parked up can it tip the cancer treatment, the chemotherapy, into the cancer cell. So this is using this antibody that's present on the ovarian cancer cell to deliver a chemotherapy drug, much like in the MORAB study. There's the early data on this are really quite exciting, a high response rate in patients who've had a number of lines of chemotherapy already. And there is a study which is shortly reopening in the UK called REJOICE, in the platinum-resistant ovarian cancer setting, which is looking at this drug in comparison with standard of care treatment. So an interesting study and one to look out for. Next slide, please. So, having done a whistle-stop tour of all of the trials and different sort of options and approaches, Tom is going to join me to go through some of the questions, and I will let him do a bit more of the talking as well with his wealth of experience. Tom was the ovarian, or I should say the gynae cancer trials officer, working with me and my team for a long while before he took on lead. And even when he was lead as well. So he not only has an awful lot of experience in clinical trials in general, but specifically within gynae cancer as well. So hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that really informative presentation. And as you said, we'll now move into the question and answer session. So we'll go straight in with some of our pre-submitted questions. So the first question we had was, are clinical trials generally only a last resort when the usual treatment options have stopped working?
So I will take that one, Tom, unless you want to.
No, that's fine for you.
So I think hopefully what you've seen, and I appreciate these questions came in before we did that actually no is the short answer. I think the phase 1, the very early trials where we're looking at a new drug and trying to work out what the best dose would be, whether it's even effective, that tends to be when you've been through the majority, if not all, of the standard treatments. But actually some of the trials that you can get involved with are very much part of standard of care treatment, where either we're looking at it in a real world setting or we're looking at just adding a new drug to what we already give. So they're throughout, I would say.
Lovely, thank you, Rebecca. And how long does a trial typically last, and what might we expect a trial to involve?
So a difficult question to answer specifically because it's very varied depending on each trial in particular. Each one will have its own kind of length. So yeah, that it can be very short. So the monitor study, for example, went on, and actually input from participants and patients taking part was really quite straightforward. It was answering some questionnaires, and that just carried on throughout the time of receiving treatment. And in terms of what to expect from taking a trial, I think Rebecca covered quite a lot of that during her talk, but there are potentially a lot of extra visits, and often with studies there's quite strict time constraints. So I would say there'll be kind of more visits to the hospital than perhaps there would be just having standard care, and we are a little bit less flexible in where we can do those and the kind of time frames of delivering those. But we're kind of there to support and help patients. We try our best to align visits when you're coming in for other things. If you're in for a blood test or you're in for a scan, we'll try and kind of make everything fit around that as best we can. But I think especially at the beginning of a study, when you're first joining a treatment trial, there are often a few extra visits, and we don't always have a huge amount of flexibility in terms of fitting those in the right timeframes.
Thank you, Tom. So it sounds like there's a huge amount of extra support available to people who are taking part in clinical trials. On that note, someone else has asked, what if I decide I don't want to continue with the clinical trial once I've started?
That's a really important question. It's something we are really careful to counsel for before going into clinical trial and during. Part of the consent process will, I would say always, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, say that this is a voluntary thing, and you can withdraw consent at any point, from an hour after, well, minutes after signing consent, during the trial, to afterwards when we're finished a treatment but we're just following up and collecting data. And crucially, it does not affect standard of care treatment. The only thing just to be mindful of is if you are on a clinical trial and you are receiving a new drug, like, for example, the one I just mentioned just now, which isn't available yet anywhere, be it America or anywhere else, it is still in the testing phase, that if you come out of that clinical trial, your receipt of that particular drug will stop. But you can then go on to receive the standard of care treatment that you would have been offered and that you would receive outside of the clinical trial. So yeah, you can come out of the trial at any point. It will not affect your clinical care with your team. It is very much a voluntary thing. But if you are receiving a novel therapy, if you come out of the clinical trial, your receipt of that drug will stop. But you can have standard care treatment. That's just the only thing to be aware of.
Yeah, and I would just like to say it made me very happy when Sylvia said exactly that. That when, as Dr. Bowen said, we talk about it a lot, but it is always voluntary, it's always optional all the way through, and we will be saying that and checking with patients throughout the duration of the study to make sure they're still happy to continue. And some people will do certain parts. They might decline a specific blood test on a day they're not particularly feeling well, or they may decline to do some of the questionnaires, and we'll kind of work around and work with patients through that.
Perfect, thank you both. So moving on to some questions around accessibility of clinical trials and the criteria for joining them. Someone has asked, at what cancer stage are clinical trials an option?
So all, and it very much depends on the trial. Some cases there will be trials looking at even prevention. So, for example, there is a study called Protector, which has been running across the UK, which is looking at women who are known to carry BRCA mutations but haven't yet had a diagnosis of cancer, looking to have preventative surgery, so ovaries and tubes removed, to try and reduce the chance of getting ovarian cancer in the first place. And in that, women are being randomized to have the tubes removed early, and then going back later on, ideally after the menopause, to have the ovaries removed. And so that is the earliest possible phase before a cancer is developed. It might be at the time that somebody first presents with their ovarian cancer diagnosis and intervention, much like with ICON 8, where we're looking at adjusting the way we gave chemotherapy. And a lot of the studies that we've done have led to, for example, PARP inhibitor maintenance, bevacizumab. These are all done at the first time that people are having treatment for ovarian cancer. And then there are some studies, like the one I referenced with that new antibody drug conjugate, which are being given after a number of lines of previous treatment. So all the way through, I would say.
And the next question is, are you able to access the same trial in every NHS trust, regardless of where you are in the UK?
No. I think probably my talk will have just said that we cannot open all trials in all centres, and that's partly because of infrastructure. It takes a lot to open up these trials in terms of resource, both financial, but importantly, clinicians and trials team, etc. But also, they're usually looking for a certain number of centres. What we do is to try and make sure that we have a good geographical spread. And I work with the team at G2G UK, which is a Gynae Trials group at UK. I'm the co-chair along with Shivani Nikam, who works at UCLH. And our role is to look at all gynae cancer trials, so obviously ovarian cancer within that, gynae cancer trials that come in into the UK, to work out, one, is this a trial that we can deliver in the UK? Does it fit with our standard of care treatment? That's important. Is it a question that we need to be answering? And if the answer is yes, then where can we deliver it? And so we've been working really very hard to try and make sure that we don't have the trial open in 3 centres in one big city, and then in Scotland, and then the rest of the country having no access at all. And so we have got better at trying to distribute it across the country and better at trying to cross-refer. But I don't think there's going to be a time where we can open all trials in all centres. It's just not feasible. And the costs of the trial and to set up would mean that the trial would never be able to open and run. So smaller trials, earlier phase trials, and in rarer indications tend to be in fewer centres, but that cross-referral is really important. It does mean that people, unfortunately, will have to travel to be able to access the treatment. But as Tom said, there is a lot of effort made to try and make sure that it is as easy as possible for people to be part of a study, so that investigations, wherever possible, are done at the same time. And with some studies, there may even be the opportunity or the option to stay locally to have that treatment delivered. Tom, I don't know if you wanted to add to that at all.
Yeah, I was going to say we've worked with some of the studies which have allowed for and provided hotel accommodation, so patients that are travelling particularly long distance can come and stay overnight if needed, either before or after their appointments or treatment. And in those days, again, we try really hard to put as much of many of the appointments as close together as possible. So if that's then review with the doctor and then treatment the following day, so that it can have one overnight stay and kind of get everything over and done with in one go. But yeah, as Dr. Bowen said, it would be very difficult to have every trial open in every centre. And from our point of view, when we're looking at new studies that are coming through and whether to open them or not, in our centre, it's a lot about our patient population and the patients that we serve and that we see in our clinics. And so we'd be opening the treatments of the trials that are most suitable for our local patients. And the kind of hospitals across the country were doing the same.
That's great. So slightly leading on from that response, someone's asked, if you go and take part in a trial at a different hospital that's further away, is there any kind of financial help available for things like travel expenses? I know you mentioned the hotel accommodation. Is that provided free of charge to the participant?
Yeah, so I can pick that one up. And that again is trial specific. So the trials that are run by commercial companies that are kind of commercially sponsored trials will often pay travel expenses, and so those costs are covered. Again, depending on the study, will depend whether that's provided to you from the start or whether it's reclaimed travel expenses. The trials are definitely moving towards kind of payment upfront. So we've had a few studies recently which provide patients that are taking part with a prepaid debit card, so that any kind of travel expenses, parking costs and food and drink for their trial visits can be just paid for from the debit card that's already preloaded, so that then no one's kind of incurring any expenses at the time. And then in the background, the trials team just make sure that's kind of got all of the right amounts of money that are required to cover those expenses. For the non-commercial studies, that's not always as good. So that's the kind of university or hospital owned studies. They do sometimes, but that again is very dependent on each study. We work very hard with our R&D department and with our charity within the hospital. So for those patients who wouldn't otherwise be able to access the trial because of travel expenses, we'll work out a way and find a way to fund that.
That's great. Thanks ever so much for that, Tom. Another question about accessing clinical trials. Are you able to self-refer for a clinical trial rather than being referred by an oncologist?
So you can. I think sometimes the nuances of the trial can mean that it needs to just be interpreted. So to make that contact, absolutely, but it would need so let's say I'm running a clinical trial in Bath and it was something that somebody was interested in outside. We do get patients contacting us directly, but it tends to be that they've spoken to their oncologist. There's not really any ego associated with this, I have to say. So it shouldn't be, and I've never seen that an oncologist would be reluctant to refer to another centre for a trial if it looked like that might benefit their patient. But yeah, absolutely, contact directly the centre and ask whether it might be relevant. They will need to. I would then need to go back to the treating oncologist, say, can I have this information? We will always need to look at pathology specimens from a biopsy or surgery. We'll need to look at bloods. We'll need to look at scan reports in the first instance, but then look at the scans, and they would usually be electronically sent across to do that. Biopsy is a first inquiry. There's absolutely no reason that you shouldn't do that. And or, as I mentioned in the study, to check with the target team, for example, whether that might be something that'd be eligible for, and then we could look into the detail and see whether that was something suitable.
Absolutely, thank you. And there's a question about the process of clinical trials being introduced into the UK. So, for instance, if there is an existing trial in the United States, how might it be considered for introduction into a UK hospital? So if one's showing particular success, for example.
So if it's, I'm not sure about the question, but if it's about opening that trial within the UK, within gynae, it's almost always these days going through an organisation called ENGOT, which is the European Gynae Cancer Trials Group. And that comes through GTG, this organisation that I mentioned before that I co-chair with a colleague at UCLH in London. Sometimes it can be the pharma companies themselves with the commercial trials that will target a particular hospital or a particular oncologist and say, do you want to open this study? And that might be more so for the earlier phase studies. Moving on from that, of course, there are drugs that have gone through early trials, and in the States, the FDA, their approval system will often approve drugs earlier before all the evidence is through and earlier than we see in Europe. That can work, but they also have withdrawn some drugs later on with more data because they've discovered that with the full testing, it wasn't the right thing to have done. In that instance, it's a little bit more tricky. If it's gone through a phase 2 trial and waiting for the phase 3 trial and there's no European license, we can't deliver it outside of a clinical trial. But usually, in summary, for the gynae studies, it will go through this organisation called ENGOT. The Americans have got their own one that we work with as well. And they'll come to ENGOT and say, which countries do you want to open in? ENGOT will come to the UK and say, is this a trial that you're interested in? Here's all the information. And we will go back and say, yes, please. These are the number of patients we think we can recruit in the UK. We send out an interest to the teams in the UK who'd be interested in being involved in this trial. How many patients do you think you can recruit? Have you got any competing trials in this space that might make it difficult to recruit? And then we go back to the sponsor and say, these would be who we'd recommend. So there's a bit of a process to it, but there's a good reason for that. And that's to make sure that the trial can run and recruit to time and get the information that we need.
So a lot of factors to consider, essentially, isn't there? Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question now about people's treatment plans. So the question is, if I join a clinical trial in a different hospital or trust from the one where I usually receive my cancer treatment, do I need to transfer my existing treatment plan to the new trial institution, both during and after the trial?
So usually during, and that's for safety really, because if someone's giving you a new drug or a new treatment, they have all of the information, so that the anti-cancer treatment that's being delivered would be delivered in the site where you're having a clinical trial. There are some exceptions, that would be the main point. Usually the expectation is on completion of the clinical trial that you go back to your referring trust and have your ongoing treatment again locally. Some people will choose to say where they are, there may be another trial that's been offered to them. But at any point along the way, if someone was unwell and urgent medical attention is needed, then their local cancer centre with their emergency department would be the place to attend. So, for example, we often in Bath, we will have patients that travel from, for example, Oxford or Cheltenham or Taunton to come to a clinical trial with us. But if there was a problem, they might attend their local emergency department and they would then let us know what has happened and the conversation would happen. But that's safety first in that. If we've referred somebody, for example, to a treatment in Oxford, they would have their treatment there. And when the trial was complete, come back and then receive further treatment as and when needed with us locally. So it's an ongoing thing, but it wouldn't be that you had gone to a trial somewhere else and then couldn't go back to your referring centre, far from it. I hope that answers that question.
Lovely, that's great, thank you. And we've got a question here about side effects. So the person writing says that they've been invited to be considered for a clinical trial, but they're concerned about side effects. They're saying that generally they feel well and quite active when they're not on treatment, but chemotherapy has made them feel quite lacking in energy in the past. So what support is available if trial participants are struggling with side effects?
So much like receiving standard treatment, be it chemotherapy or otherwise, there will always be a 24-hour emergency telephone number to use if there are severe untoward side effects out of hours, at weekends, during the day. There will always be that. There will also be the trials team contact details. They may not be 24/7, but with more minor side effects, that you might contact the trials team with more specific information on that particular drug. I would say in general it's exactly the same. The emergencies to the emergency telephone number, but the standard would have the additional advantage of the trials team. There will always be reviews, be it clinic appointments, face-to-face, telephone, looking to pick up side effects. And if anything, when you're on a clinical trial, we're eager to collect as much information on side effects as possible. So you will be asked probably ad nauseum about potential side effects that you might have received, including some that you hadn't even considered. So because it's really important part of the clinical trial. So I wouldn't think that that would be a reason not to get involved. I think it's always a difficult decision when you're weighing up pros and cons, but I think management of side effects is very much a part of the clinical trial and something that we would be looking at and addressing.
Wonderful, thank you. So moving on to questions about the types of clinical trials. Are there any trials for people who are BRCA and HRD negative, Rebecca?
Yes, there are. Majority of patients will not have a BRCA mutation, and just about the majority will not have HRD or homologous recombination defects with high-grade ovarian cancer. So there are some studies that are specifically looking at BRCA mutation carriers or HRD tumours, but often they are trials for all, where they may just stratify. And by that, I mean they find out the information and then look as part of the analysis of the trial to see whether there is any difference in benefit according to whether there's a BRCA mutation or according to whether or not a tumour is homologous recombination deficient or proficient. So yes, there are a number of studies that are looking at, if you like, all comers, but may well stratify with that information to see whether there's any different benefit from one group to another.
Okay, thank you. We've had a couple of questions that are asking about trials available for people who have had to come off maintenance therapies, where perhaps the maintenance therapy hasn't worked for someone. I'm just wondering if there's anything available at the moment.
So the maintenance therapies are there in order to try and maintain the benefit from chemotherapy for longer. For some people, inevitably, there will be disease progression or relapse at some point, of which there will be standard of care chemotherapy options available, and there are and will be clinical trials coming through all the time. Some of them will be open currently, but may not be open in 9 months' time because they've completed, and another one will come through. But there are a number of trials that are either opening or in development, looking, for example, at these antibody drug conjugates, the ADCs that I just referred to. And some of those studies are looking at people where the disease has come back after maintenance. The MORAB study that Sylvia mentioned is looking at an alpha folate receptor antibody drug conjugate, and there's a drug called mirvetuximab, which is another one of those, similar to that one, which has got a license in America for recurrent ovarian cancer and is going through NICE, our regulatory body, currently. So that may even be available as a treatment option for some. About 40% of ovarian cancers have that alpha folate receptor, so it's not for everybody. There's only benefit if that receptor is there. But you can see that there's a trial looking at another drug from another company, which is using the same receptor, but a different drug attached to it. And that's not the only one. And there are other clinical trials in that setting as well. So yes, there's a long answer to, are there? Yes, there are a number. Quite what's available will depend on when and what treatments had before, etc. But yes, there are.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. So we will shortly have to bring the Q&A to a close. Just wanted to ask you both, what is the one thing you want everyone to take away from today's Q&A session or presentation in general about clinical trials? Shall we go to you first, Tom?
Yeah, sure. So I know we talked about this before, but to say don't be nervous, and please don't be nervous. We're here to kind of help and support, and there'll be kind of a trials team involved, and yeah, we're here to help kind of support you and your loved ones through treatment, and yeah, hopefully we're nice and helpful, and we can give you all of the information that you need to help you make a decision about whether or not a trial is the right thing. And as Sylvia said in her talk, just by signing up doesn't hold you to anything at all. It's just a way of allowing us to start the process. When we take in consent, we're just starting the process to get the ball rolling for a trial.
Perfect, thank you. And Rebecca?
So I was really very keen for everyone to consider all the options that are available to them, and to make sure that you ask the questions not just of your oncologist, but the trials team and those around you. Is this trial really the right thing for me? Do I need to be considering it at this point? What is it going to, there's lots of questions I'm saying, but what is it going to add potentially for me, and what are the drawbacks? And if I'm going to be traveling every week, 3 or 4 hours each time I want to have treatment, is that the right thing for me? Is there a trial where I can participate and potentially gain benefit, but that is closer to home, that might not? Patients might travel for a long distance but stay with family, and that actually can be quite beneficial. But I think we just need to make sure that you're not going into something where your contribution is exceeding quality of life, and making sure that it's, yes, there's some altruism to going into a clinical trial, but make sure that it's the right thing for you. Knowing, as Tom had said, that at any point, if you didn't feel that it was the right thing for you, that you could stop participation.
Perfect. Thank you to you both. So we're going to end the Q&A session now. We are really sorry if we've been unable to answer your specific question today. As I'm sure you've seen from the chat, there's been a huge amount of questions coming in just during the session, but we also had an awful lot of pre-submitted questions. Please do be aware that we have a clinical trials area on our website, and there is a lot of information about clinical trials, including things to talk to your clinical team about in terms of clinical trials. And we do also have a database on that area that contains information about the phase 3 and phase 4 clinical trials that are open to those who have an ovarian cancer diagnosis. It's a really great database. You can search by your tumour type, your stage of treatment, and also your postcode, so you can have a look at which areas clinical trials are running near to you. It's regularly updated by our fantastic nurse advisor team, and our nurses on the support line are always really happy to speak to anybody about accessing clinical trials, or indeed about anything else related to ovarian cancer, and that's for both those with a diagnosis and also family and friends. So if you do have any questions or concerns, or indeed if you just wanted to have a chat with our nurses, please do give Val or Anne, our nurses, a call on 0808 802 6000, and that's a free phone number. I'm sure you'll all join me in saying a massive thank you to Sylvia for sharing her story and her experience with us, but also to our experts, Rebecca and Tom, who have left us, but we will certainly share that feedback with them. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it and found it really informative. And on behalf of the Target Ovarian Cancer team, thank you again for your time, and we do hope to see you again soon. Thank you.